What is going on, everyone? We are now live, and we're going to be talking everything smallmouth fishing, summertime smallmouth movements and patterns. I get this video requested a lot. People want to know where they can go to find fish, how they can more successfully and easily go out and have success on the water. And I kind of moved away from smallmouth focused content, but I think this is really well timed and can help a lot of people go out and have a little bit more success this time of year, because it can be kind of tough. A lot of people think that summertime is one of the best times to be on the water, which in my opinion it is, because you can do a whole bunch of different things and catch them, but it can be tough, especially with how much these fish move around. So I really appreciate everyone hopping in this live stream. Now, before we get this thing started, I have to do a little bit of a plug. This live stream is sponsored by Akaso. So Akaso sent me this cooler, and it's actually a pretty big cooler. If you guys have ever seen the Yeti coolers, this is built pretty much identical to the Yeti cooler, but it's significantly cheaper. This is $145 right now on Amazon versus the Yeti cooler, which is, I think, $430. So it's a lot cheaper, but they sent this to me to try out. I've used this for over a month now since Alex has been up here, so about 2 months, and really liked it. I took it on the pontoon with my family. I brought it on the boat quite a bit, but it's huge. You can fit a whole bunch of different things. Full bags of 7-pound bags of ice, a bunch of drinks, and it's just a really nice cooler, well built, and it keeps ice a long time. So if you're looking for a cooler, looking for something portable, you have the backpack straps here. It's really nice to be able to lug this thing around, carry pop, Powerade, water, whatever you want in that cooler, and just really nice cooler that you can get at a more affordable price than the Yeti. So shout out to Akaso. If you guys want to check this out, there's a link down in the description under Akaso cooler, and you guys can go check that out. But I've really enjoyed using this thing over the past couple of months. But like I said, this live stream here is going to be talking about smallmouth patterns, movements, and how these fish are moving throughout the summertime. This is specifically focused on summertime fishing, where these fish are going, where they're going to, and how they move throughout the summertime. And what I've found to be the most effective ways to target them. So we're going to share the screen here. If you guys have never been part of a seminar, the way I do this is I have a PowerPoint going alongside my picture of my face. We'll kind of bounce in and out between the two screens. But if you guys have any questions, what you can do is go in the comment section, drop me a question, and I'll try to address it as it fits into the live stream. So first things first, this is the outline of the seminar tonight. We're going to be first defining summer fishing. What does summer fishing mean, especially as it relates to smallmouth and different styles of bodies of water? Because we're not just talking about St. Clair. We're not just talking about river fishing. We're going to try to cover the gamut, talk about rivers and reservoirs, glacial bodies of water, Great Lakes, and other big bodies of water. Then we're going to understand the conditions, how the conditions impact what these fish do. And then we're going to talk about how weather impacts smallmouth, the key forage that they like to key in on, productive locations, and how to have success when you're going out and targeting smallmouth during the summertime. So that's going to be the basic outline of tonight's seminar. But if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to go down and drop them in the comment section. I'll try to address them throughout. So the biggest thing they have to understand, and this is smallmouth in general, this is all year long. This is pretty much the biggest key that I can give you guys to smallmouth fishing, and that is that they live a nomadic lifestyle. So what does it mean to be nomadic? What does it mean to be a nomad? It means that you basically have no permanent home. You're not stuck on a specific piece of cover or structure. You don't live in a specific area. The majority of smallmouth like to bounce around, and they like to move a lot. So if you guys ever watch smallmouth tournaments, you're going to notice a guy will catch 25 pounds one day and then catch 3 fish the next day. And the reason for that is the fish that he was fishing for had moved. And this happens a lot because they're super bait fish oriented, and they're super driven by very specific factors that have them in that spot. So they live a nomadic lifestyle, and that's what makes them so difficult to target sometimes. And they like to move around a lot. And I'm not talking like, here's a rock ridge, they move from one end to the other. This is like they move from this rock ridge to the rock ridge, like half a mile up the lake, because that's where the bait fish went, or that's where the current's pushing in harder. And we'll dive into the kind of what is driving those movements as we go throughout this live stream. But this is a really, really key piece to understand. And this is why a lot of people struggle to have consistency when they're out smallmouth fishing, is that smallmouth don't necessarily want to sit in the same spot, especially during the summertime when they're driven by a bunch of different factors. So what does summer months mean to me? And this is really going to be very specific on the types of bodies of water that we're fishing. And like I said, I don't want to get locked into saying rivers, glacial lakes, the Great Lakes. This is going to be very general. We're going to really kind of dive into each one and as it pertains to each one. So rivers and reservoirs, what I would consider this are those bodies of water that are a little bit shallower or maybe a little bit more current driven areas. Rivers and reservoirs, you start to notice them pushing out towards summer patterns around 73-ish degrees. So when you get into that mid to low 70-degree range, that's when I start to notice the fish moving around into specific summertime locations. Glacial bodies of water, which we have a ton of up here in Michigan. This is kind of one of the most difficult styles of lake to fish, in my opinion, for summertime smallmouth. Hits that around 70 degrees. Those lakes stay overall generally a little bit cooler. So around that 70-degree mark is, for me, what I would consider summertime fishing. And the Great Lakes and St. Clair included in this, I would say about 68 to 70 degrees, sort of that upper 60-degree range. But you're going to notice that fluctuate a lot, because what happens is you get certain winds that push, the water around, and so you get different water temperatures, but really around that upper 60 to low 70-degree range. And a lot of times the Great Lakes won't get more than about 73 degrees, with the exception of maybe Erie. That gets warmer, but that's because you have all that algae and you have all that shallow water. So for the most part, I'd say around 68 to 70 degrees. And that's what I would define as the summer months. And so what the summer months to me means are typically those summer locations, areas that fish are going to pot up in. And I'm not even going to say deep water, and you'll understand why as we dive into this live stream. But summer to me is defined by these temperatures, and that's going to drive how these fish act, because it's basically after post spawn into summer, before the summer to fall transition, which is another really tough time to fish. So now we're going to really dive into understanding the conditions, and this is really the most critical piece of this entire seminar. I wanted to kind of keep this at the beginning because I believe that understanding the conditions is going to help you follow these fish as they start to move throughout the summertime, because like we talked about, they're nomadic creatures. They want to move a lot. And so by understanding what is driving them, you can sort of get an idea of where they're going to go and what they're going to be doing. So the biggest thing for me, the drivers of smallmouth during the summertime, are bait fish and forage, cover and current, and feeding opportunities. These are the three main drivers that I believe move these fish more than anything else, and kind of in this order. So bait fish and forage, to me, this is my number one factor. This is the thing that's going to cause these fish to move a lot, because these fish are going to move as the bait fish move, and as the forage that they're feeding on move around the body of water, which happens a lot, especially if they're on bait fish. You won't necessarily notice this as much with crawfish and gobies, but if they're on bait really heavily, as that bait starts to move and fluctuate and kind of bounce around areas, these smallmouth are going to follow suit, and they're also going to be moving around. So this is something that's super important to really understand, and kind of even maybe take some time and understand what the forage does, so you can get a better understanding of what the smallmouth are going to be doing, because wherever that bait goes, wherever the forage is, that's a lot of times where the smallmouth are going to be. So the key with bait fish is that they move around a lot. The gobies don't necessarily tend to move around quite as much, but we're going to touch on that as we start to understand the forage types. But if you're on bait fish oriented smallmouth, it can be a big, tough task to stay on these fish for a long period of time, because they do tend to move around quite a bit, and they really want to follow that bait and forage. And fish also look for the easiest feeding opportunities and easiest opportunity for them to catch, to feed up, just like us as humans, right? Like, our biggest goal is to maintain our ability to have access to water, housing, or shelter, and food, right? And so these fish are the same way. They want to have a place that they can hang out for a little bit and rest and relax. They want to have easy access to food. And so by doing that, they basically just follow their forage around. And that's a huge driver for these fish during the summertime, when their metabolism is when their metabolism is really high, and they're having to move around a lot. They'll tend to follow that forage as well. Cover and current to me is number two. This is something that really helps position fish more than I think it does impact the fish quite as much, especially as we start to talk about rivers and reservoirs. But cover and current really drives where these fish are going to set up on certain areas. So one thing that you'll notice is during the summertime, you get especially on the Great Lakes, you'll get a strong wind blowing from a certain direction, and these fish are going to set up on one side or the other of whatever piece of cover you're fishing. Well, that current that's coming in from the wind is helping position the bait fish, which is helping position the bass on very specific areas or locations of this offshore cover. So understanding the way that current impacts where these fish are setting up is really important. The other big thing is cover, right? So what does cover offer these fish? And to me, it offers them a home. It offers them a place to sit, ambush, and really just effectively feed. So for me, these are the things that are going to offer them the easiest feeding opportunities, and they want to basically set up in a way that will set them up for point 3, which is feeding opportunities, and just have the easiest access to that food source. Now, cover is really interchangeable from the sense that it is shallow and deep. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Like you have cover out deep, you have cover up shallow. And I know a lot of people, when they think about cover, they think about laydowns, they think about logs, they think about wood, rocks. It can be deep as well. Deep cover is going to be a big player for summertime smallmouth, just as much as shallow cover will be. And then feeding opportunities. To me, feeding opportunities is really important because bass are opportunistic creatures. They want to feed. They want the easiest feeding opportunity to basically fatten up and stay fat and enjoy their time during the summertime months. Their metabolism is sped up and they tend to move around a lot more, so they need to eat. And a lot of times the easiest feeding opportunity is going to be where they set up. So use that when you start to think about summertime fishing locations. Where can they most easily feed and effectively target bait fish? And I think this is why a lot of times in the summertime those fish group up, is because by grouping up, they can more easily actively feed on the bait fish and the forage that they're feeding on. Now, this is where weather conditions really come into play. And to me, this is a huge factor that I think goes overlooked a lot during the summertime because a lot of us don't have control over this. There's absolutely zero control over the sun and clouds or the weather conditions that you're fishing, but it has a huge impact on what these fish do, where they position, and how they feed. The biggest thing here is just understanding what these two things, which is sun and clouds, do to the bait and the bass, and how it impacts their ability to go out and basically feed. So for me, we'll start with the sun, right? So what does the sun do to these fish? First of all, it's going to increase their activity and the feeding levels. A lot of time when there's sun, it increases their visibility, which is point number 2. So they can see a lot further in the water, and that's going to let them feed a lot more effectively. It's also going to position these fish a little bit more effectively, right? Drive these fish to very specific areas. And so because of that, they're going to be able to more effectively group up and target and ambush bait fish. So those points all kind of feed into fish activity and feeding levels. It's going to drive that up because they're more effectively able to feed and they're more effectively able to set up on the pieces of cover that are down there wherever they're hanging out. And finally, they travel further to eat. A lot of times in the sun, what you'll notice as we dive into this later, when there's a lot of sun, they can see bait fish from a longer period or longer distance. And so what they'll do is they'll travel longer distances to get that. That's going to make jerk baits and moving baits more effective. That's going to make baits up in the column a lot more effectively than when there's cloud or it's overcast. I'm going to touch on some questions here in a second. Let me just finish the sun and the points about the sun, and then I'll talk about some of the questions that I'm getting. One of the struggles with the sun is when there's no wind and there's no current, it's going to cause those fish to roam. So when it's really sunny and it's slick, calm, those fish are going to pull off of the cover, and they're really just going to kind of roam and hang out and be semi-inactive, right? Because they don't necessarily have to feed. They can see really well, so they can inspect your bait really effectively, and there's nothing driving them or holding them on that piece of cover, especially in deeper water, other than the sun. So they can not only see your bait really effectively, and they can really have a decision of whether or not they want to eat it, but there's no current that's forcing them to be on that cover And so this causes them to roam a lot. And it also makes them spooky. A lot of times this is when boat position is going to come into play. Your line size, your bait color. This is when it's going to really make a difference. When it's sunny and it's slick calm and it's flat, it's going to be a lot more evident when it's flat, calm, and sunny. So one of the questions that I got that I really like was, when you say grouped up, how many fish are you talking about? During the early summer months, when you're just getting into the summertime patterns, especially out deep, you're talking about small schools, 2, 3, 4 fish. But as the summer progresses, these fish are going to sort of find each other. And a lot of times smallmouth tend to be pack animals. I know that's like maybe not the right term, but they tend to herd up, they tend to group up, and they'll kind of follow each other around. So as the summer progresses, you're going to notice these schools get bigger. And then as the summer kind of draws to an end, these fish are going to kind of spread out again as they start transition into the fall time period. So early summer, you're talking really small schools, 2 to 6, 5 fish. Then you're going to get to a peak point, which I would say should be happening here in the next couple of weeks. And then they're going to get really, really grouped up basically at the beginning of September. And then just like nothing, they're going to dissipate and they're going to start to transition out once that weather like really starts to break into the fall. So small groups to absolutely massive groups, and then they're going to break up again towards the end of the summertime. So we talked about the impacts that sun have on what these fish are doing, but let's start to look at what the clouds do, because to me, clouds, I don't want to say is the death of smallmouth fishing, but it definitely has more of an impact than the sun does. To me, the sun increases your ability to go out and be successful smallmouth fishermen, but the clouds really start to make things difficult because, yeah, the fish are less spooky. They tend to be a little bit easier to catch. You don't have to worry so much about the bait color and the boat position and everything, but the struggle is they like to roam a lot more, especially on deep water areas. When it's sunny out and there's a lot of wind or current, those fish are going to really want to hold on those pieces of cover. But when it's kind of overcast and cloudy, those fish aren't necessarily going to want to set up on those areas quite as easily. They're going to want to roam more, and so it can make it a little bit more difficult. But because they're roaming, they're typically off bottom, and they can possibly be easier to find with electronics, which is kind of a benefit, I guess I would say. The struggle with clouds is that they like to get out of schools. A lot of times when these fish start roaming and they start to kind of just follow food sources, they tend to kind of get out of those massive schools, and you'll notice 2 or 3 here and 2 or 3 here, and some fish shallow and some fish deep. They don't necessarily all want to group up. And it also reduces your visibility. Not only your visibility, but the visibility of fish. One of the struggles, especially when it's overcast, is you have no ability really to see into the water, or less ability to see into the water. And so what happens is you can't be as effective when you're fishing shallow. This is why deep patterns will play a lot more when it's cloudy out, and those fish tend to be a little bit easier to catch in deep water when it's cloudy out than up shallow. And fish also become a lot less predictable because, as I mentioned, they don't want to hold on cover as well. So those are the really the big impacts that I noticed sun and clouds having on these smallmouth. And we'll dive into this over the next couple of slides as well. But does anyone have any questions about just the quick overview that I did on sun and clouds and the impacts that it has on these fish? Mike asked a question, do you ever mess with drop swimming? So drop swimming essentially is where you take a drop shot and then you take a little swim bait on the back of it. And the benefit of this is that you can cast this bait out, let it get to bottom, and slowly swim it along, but that bait's still up in the column, right? So this is a really effective way to take a swim bait and keep it a fixed height off the bottom. I don't necessarily do this very much. For me, I'm very much target fishing with a drop shot. I'm casting it to a very specific piece of cover. It's a really effective technique, but for me, I'd rather use my electronics and know I'm on a boulder or know I'm around the fish than drop swim. I think it's an effective tool, especially when it's cloudy or there's a lot of current, though, because what that current's going to do is naturally cause that bait to have shimmy and action. So it can be an effective technique. I don't do it very much. If I'm using a drop shot with a little swim bait on it, it's around current situations and it's around areas where that bait can actually have natural movement down there without me really having to swim it. But that's just a personal preference thing. I know there's time and place. Caleb Bell did it up here on St. Clair, but I've just never really had success with that. Okay, let's move to this next slide. Okay, So this slide here, this is my most simplified version of what I would do during certain situations based on the conditions. Okay. So what you have here, if you guys can see my cursor, you can't. What you have here is sun and wind in the top left, hence the sun and the wind. And when it's sunny and windy, I'm fishing deep cover. Okay. I'm fishing deep water where there's isolated boulders, where there's a grass edge, where there's a mixture of bottom compositions. That's when I'm going deep. When it's sunny and calm, which is this top right here, I'm going to be fishing shallow cover. So what I'm going to be doing when it's flat, slick, calm, and sunny, I'm going to move up shallow, especially if I can see into the water, and I'm going to cover a lot of water. I'm going to be fishing isolated pieces of cover. For me, the benefit of this is that not only can I see in the water, but these fish can see a long ways, and they tend to group up and they tend to be fairly predictable because when it's sunny, they want to have an ambush point and you can effectively pick them off from a long ways away. Another big thing when it's sunny and calm is these fish like to group up on very, very isolated pieces of cover. So if you find one rock, you might have 10 fish around it because they're all hanging out there looking to ambush. You guys, if you guys have watched any of the St. Lawrence Big Five tournament, what these guys are doing, like Scott Dobson was doing, Joey Cifuentes was doing, and had success with the first 3 days, was they were fishing shallow cover areas with spy baits and hair jigs and basically going up shallow and picking these fish off. You always notice them when they catch one. They're like, oh my God, there's 5 or 6 with it. Well, the reason is those fish tend to group up when it's shallow and calm, or when it's sunny and calm. And so by using and targeting these isolated pieces of cover, you can do that effectively when it's sunny and calm out. Now, when it's cloudy and windy, I like to fish deep cover. So this might seem counterintuitive, but when it's cloudy, a lot of times it doesn't have as big of an impact on deep water fish. The reason for that is those deep water fish tend to typically be on, they tend to be on a very specific piece of cover or structure down there. So they tend to be fairly predictable. But what happens is when it's windy, there's a lot of natural currents in the water. And so these fish will position on cover in deep water, even though it's not ideal with that sun, right? So even though it's not ideal, even though that sun isn't pinning them to that cover, that current is going to force those fish to very specific pieces of isolated cover in deeper water. Now, when it's the most unideal conditions for smallmouth, it's cloudy and flat calm. This is when those fish are going to get on those deeper water areas and they're going to roam. They're going to roam around that cover. They're going to roam around those pieces of deep water structure. And I find it's easiest to catch these fish looking for deep water roamers. I'm going to touch on some of these questions that I'm getting right now in the next slide. This is just for me, like the most basic rules of fishing during certain conditions. Are sunny or cloudy days better? For me, the most ideal conditions are sunny with some wind. It's going to help position those fish. It's going to make them fairly predictable. Or if you're a big shallow water fisherman, I would prefer sunny and flat calm conditions because you can see them a long ways. It's like sight fishing for them. Why do the smallmouth stay out in their deep spots when it's cloudy instead of chasing bait up shallow? So in my opinion, the reason they do this is visibility, right? Like they're not as impacted. That cloudy weather doesn't impact their vision near as much in deeper water. Obviously the sun helps, but in that deep water, they're still able to feed effectively. They're still able to hang out. But up shallow, there's a lot bigger impact between the sun and the clouds, especially when it gets shallow, especially when it gets cloudy out. It's really going to impact the way they can feed, and they really impact your ability to see them in the shallow water. And then what do I consider shallow water? Shallow is going to be relative, basically as deep as I can see. So if I'm in 10 foot of visibility, like 12 foot's going to be pretty shallow. But if I'm in 3 foot of visibility, that's really going to be a tough situation because a lot of times if I can't see into that water, I can't effectively target the shallow water fish or not nearly as well. So shallow is going to be very relative based on my ability to see into the water. But as this slide right here is going to talk about, there's always going to be a class of fish that's going to be available in both situations. You're always going to have a group of shallow fish. You're always going to have a group of deep fish. I don't care if it's pre-spawn. I don't care if it's winter. These fish are always going to be in both situations, shallow and deep. And so that's what I'm going to try to help you understand in this situation during the summertime. So sunny and calm for me, shallow water, those fish are feeding by sight and they want to hang out around the cover. In the deep water situations, when it's sunny and calm, those fish are going to want to suspend and they're going to roam around a lot. They're going to be really, really finicky. They're going to kind of hang out and they're just going to kind of suspend and roam and chase bait. And they're not really going to position on anything because there's nothing holding them to that cover. And so those are how I think the fish act when it's sunny and calm. When it's sunny and windy or there's current, shallow water fish are going to want to roam around those flats. That sun isn't going to position them very specifically on those pieces of cover so they can roam around and feed really effectively, and they're not necessarily going to be pinned on certain pieces of cover, and I can't as effectively catch them. One, I can't see into the water as well. Two, those fish aren't going to be locked on those pieces of cover effectively. So for me, sunny and windy is when I would go deep. But if you're a shallow water fisherman, this could be a great time to get up shallow and throw a spinnerbait, or throw a jerk bait, or throw a moving bait and cover a ton of water because they're going to still be up there roaming around. Deep water during sunny and wind, I'm going to be fishing cover areas because that's where those fish are going to be ambushing bait. Cloudy and calm. Cloudy and calm, the shallow fish are going to roam around and scatter. They're going to get out of those schools. They're going to get out of those groups, but they're still going to be up there. They're just maybe not as effectively feeding. They're not going to be as effectively able to see your bait. And so they're not going to feed quite as well. They're still catchable in shallow water. But to me, this is when I'm going to be going deeper because those fish are going to roam. They may be not as active as if it were sunny, but they will still be catchable in the deep water. I don't think those deep water fish are near as affected by the sun and clouds as much as the wind. And then cloudy and windy. To me, those shallow water fish are going to feed in the wind-blown areas. So when it's cloudy and windy, I'm going to be looking for the areas that the wind is blowing in the hardest because those fish are going to get positioned on the bait that's up in the windier blown areas or the current situational areas. So if there's current flowing out of a river, if there's wind blowing onto a point, I'm going to be looking for these areas where there's a lot of wind and a lot of current that's holding these fish on very specific pieces of cover structure. And then deep water, fish are going to hold on cover, but they're going to be a lot less active. So you're going to really have to drop it on them. You're going to have to hit them on the head. You're going to have to put it in their face. You're going to have to go darker baits that are going to silhouette so they can see it a little more effectively because they're not going to necessarily be able to see the bait from as far, and so they're going to be less active. Up North makes a good comment here. He says, I think that's my problem. I forget there's always fish shallow and always fish deep. That's true. I think that's one of the things that I struggle with too. I get very locked in because I'm like, oh man, I caught him really good yesterday afternoon on this deep piece of cover. And I go back out there and they're not there because the conditions are totally different. And I don't necessarily make the adjustments I need to make. And I get locked into maybe what happened in the past or what I think I should be doing, but there's always going to be a group shallow and always going to be a group deep. So yeah, you just kind of have to pick what you're confident in and then figure out what makes sense to you to fish during the certain conditions. What's the best bait or method for locating schools or groups of fish in deeper water? This is where electronics are going to come into play. Not necessarily to locate fish. So electronics, the biggest misconception with electronics, especially with smallmouth, is you're not looking to locate the bass. You're just not. One, you'd have to literally drive right over them. A lot of times these fish in deeper water are going to be off bottom, so your side imaging isn't nearly as effective. But you're looking for the areas that these fish are going to hold. So I think you're probably talking about Lake St. Clair. Lake St. Clair is infamous for being nearly impossible to graph with your electronics and find the bass. But what you can do is you can graph around and you can find isolated pieces of cover down in the water that these fish are going to hang out around. So one of my best spots on Lake Huron is an isolated boulder field off of a main reef. And one of the benefits here is that these fish, I can easily identify those isolated boulders off of the reef, but I can't necessarily see the fish on it. One of the benefits is I can go back to the area and use my 2D sonar or my live scope, depending on what you have, I would pretty much assume that everyone that's smallmouth fishing on Great Lakes has 2D sonar on the front of their boat. You can go around to these areas and get over these boulders, and you can see if there are fish on them. So you want to use your 2D, you want to use your side scan, you want to use your electronics to locate productive looking areas, and then you either want to fish through them or you want to look on your 2D or your down imaging. But to me, deep water, I'm going to be using my electronics a lot, graphing around looking for areas that look productive, and then you just have to fish through it to see if there are fish on it. Okay. Excuse me. Now we're going to really talk about forage types. This is something I think I'm going to have some unique insights on this, and I think this is going to be a very unique perspective on this that people aren't going to necessarily expect. There's a great question from Jim Boyko. I fish St. Clair, and what time of year should I start and end fishing the drop-off in the Detroit River? I don't necessarily know. I know the rivers get really good basically towards the end of July, basically through the, I would say, middle to end of September. The thing that's going to drive these fish to the rivers is basically a push of bait fish up in the river areas. And this is going to be the driving force, bait fish, bait fish, bait fish, bait fish. Really drives us into this next point effectively. But the biggest thing is going to drive these fish up into those rivers are the bait and the shad and the emerald shiners and all the other bait fish that are trying to make their migrations either back towards the area or up into the rivers, right, to spawn. I believe they do spawn in the fall. So figuring out where these bait fish or when these bait fish are moving up into the rivers is going to be the biggest driving factor. And a lot of times that happens right about now through mid-September. So I have two different locations on the screen of different types of forage. The top half are your mid to upper column feeding bait fish, and the bottom are your bottom dwellers. And this is going to be something kind of unique that I think a lot of people aren't going to expect. So to me, the biggest bass that I'm going to catch are going to be bait fish oriented. The biggest smallmouth that I'm going to catch during the summertime months, not necessarily all year, but during the summertime months, are going to be bait fish oriented. There's a very specific reason for this, and that is just that it's a bigger food source. So what these fish can do is they can follow it and they can stay around that bait fish and they can feed up constantly. They literally have to swim around with their mouths open. The problem with these fish is they're not nearly as easy to find as the gobies and crawfish. Gobies and crawfish that are bottom dwelling creatures are going to be great food sources for these fish. They can sit around them really effectively and they can feed constantly, but I just don't think they're I don't think they create as big a smallmouth as the baitfish oriented smallmouth are. So for me, my number one food source is going to be bait fish, and it's really going to progress throughout the year. So very early summer, what I'm going to be looking for are perch oriented or shiner oriented bait fish. Okay. Early summer, the perch are going to play and the shiners are going to play for me. As the summer progresses, the perch become a little bit more difficult to find, basically until they start to move back up shallow towards the late summer into the early fall. The perch are going to be tough. And the shiners are really going to be in just these massive, massive schools, and they're going to be relatively easy to find because they're not difficult to find. You graph around an area and you see your screen blow up with shiners. Then in the midsummer, which is where we're at right now, these three on the right-hand side of the screen here, your shiners, your alewife, and your shad are going to be a lot easier to find, and they're going to be a lot easier food source. This is a key that I don't really talk about. I'm going to give this one to you guys as kind of my appreciation, right? The easiest way to figure out where the bait fish are, and here thereby where the smallmouth tend to typically be, is look for the walleye boats, look for the perch boats, because they're following the same food source that the smallmouth are following, which are your shiners and your alewife during the middle of summertime. So wherever your perch or your walleye fishermen are, perch or walleye fishermen are, that's where your smallmouth are going to be hanging out around. So look for those boats, especially if you're on the Great Lakes, especially if you're on, your perch and walleye fisheries. That's going to be a really easy way to identify where those fish are. Now, late summer, what happens is a very unique thing. So one, your perch moves shallow, your perch will group up. Your white bass, which I haven't talked about much, your white bass will be basically young of the year, small white bass, and then all of your bait fish, with maybe the exception of shad, are going to group up in these deep water areas. So you have 4 out of these 5 grouped up as easy targets for smallmouth to eat, and these are going to be my main keys. Now, the bottom dwelling forage types, your round goby, which is what is basically infesting all of our lakes. I mean, I saw it in Hubbard Lake the other day. It's obviously in the Great Lakes. I'm sure it's in some of the river systems. The round goby is going to be a huge food source. We all hear about people talk about it as a protein pellet for smallmouth, and it is. And then your crawfish are going to be a huge factor, especially when there's a crawfish hatch. So this is what's going to drive me to go fish for these shallower water crawfish feeding bass, is when there's a big crawfish hatch. And a lot of times this happens around the full moon. So when you get these giant full moons, you're going to have a crawfish hatch on these rock flats. And in the shallow water, this can be a great time of year to go up and catch numbers of fish, but also giant smallmouth during the summertime. And shallow water is when there's a full moon and there's a crawfish hatch and there's light wind. It's going to be a great time to go up shallow and throw a Ned rig, throw a jig, throw a dark sleeper, throw those bottom dwelling baits that are going to trigger those fish when there's a crawfish hatch. This happened on St. Lawrence. A lot of guys overlook this, but when Taku won, a lot of the shallower water guys were catching them around crawfish feeders, because there was a huge crawfish hatch starting to happen when Taku won that event. But the round gobies, so here's the reason I don't think round gobies play near as much during the summertime as they do during the spring and the fall. These fish a lot of times will move out towards deeper water a lot more. And yes, there are gobies out there, but I think there's more accessibility to bait fish. And so as these fish are moving in and out following the forage, they're not going to be as keyed in on the gobies. You'll obviously have a class of fish that stays shallow or shallower and feeds on gobies, but I think the most part, the bigger fish tend to move quite a bit. Yeah. So up north says, I experienced a crawfish hatch early summer. Fish were spitting up small crawfish. It's going to happen. And then you're going to have them spit up big crawfish craws too. It's really, really cool. But it's something very unique. But in my opinion, the bait fish feeders are going to be the bigger fish. Paxton Glenn says, how do you locate deep fish when they're not locating or relating to cover but hanging around the bait? Biggest thing is finding the bait, right? Like, that sounds so simple, and it sort of can be. The problem is you're going to have to figure out where the bait's at, and a lot of times if you 2D sonar the bait fish, you'll see the bait up top. The smallmouth will be hanging out below the bait. This happened to me when I found an alewife bite a couple of years ago. What was happening was there were these alewife, and they'd move around, constantly moving because they're 10 foot below the top of the surface. The bass would be literally below the alewife. You drop it down through the alewife with like a 3/4 ounce weight, and you catch the bass below them. Really, really unique, but you just have to kind of find the bait fish and graph as many of them as you possibly can until you figure out, one, a productive location, and two, where the bait fish are nearby that productive location. And a lot of times those are going to be the ingredients for bass. Besides finding walleye and perch boats, is there another effective way to find offshore schools of bait? The biggest thing, yes, following bait fish is important. But as we touch into these next couple slides, so I keep talking about bait, and I keep talking about how to find, smallmouth around bait. The biggest thing is finding the productive location, the key areas that are going to hold the bass or keep the bass there for a short period of time, and then finding the bait fish nearby those productive locations. So we're going to touch on this, Matt. That's a really, really good question, but we're going to touch on this in the next couple of slides. So give me 1 second. I kind of covered this slide. Quite a bit on the last one, but we're just going to touch on it. The types of forage basically are bait fish and bottom dwellers. On average, bigger fish are feeding on bait fish, typically around isolated cover or on flats. They're super nomadic, so these fish are going to move around a lot. And I think this is one of the questions that Matt has is how do you stay on top of these bait fish? Like, how do you know where they're going to move to? The biggest thing is you have to move. You can't go to a spot where you say, yes, I just caught them here. They're going to be here again. The bait fish are going to move. The bass are going to follow. So you need to have 10 locations that you can stop on. Nope, they're not here. Stop on? Nope, they're not here. You have to be able to move and kind of bounce around until you figure out exactly where they're at. And that's going to be one of the biggest and most difficult things with catching these summertime fish is having a bunch of spots that you can bounce around to. Because the bait fish are super driven by the current, super driven by the water temps. They're super driven by a whole bunch of different things. So you have to have a bunch of areas you can literally bounce around to and check a bunch of different things. And a lot of times the bait's going to hold smaller schools of fish. This is kind of not exciting to hear, but these fish that are super nomadic, they're not going to be these mega schools. They're not going to be hundreds of fish big, but they're typically going to be your bigger than average fish. Now, the bottom dwellers, these are going to hold larger schools because they're really easy to find, and they're typically in stable locations. So a lot of times these fish that are feeding on gobies and crawfish and they're around these mega crawfish hatches are going to be big schools, but a lot of times they are smaller than average fish. However, the fish are going to get fatter more quickly. This is why I think they play such a big deal, especially in the early spring and during the fall, is fish can feed up super easily and get really fat really quickly on gobies and crawfish. But a lot of times the smallmouth that are feeding on the bait fish are just the bigger class fish that are looking for an easier, faster, bigger meal. And then finally, they're in way more predictable areas. The bottom dwellers pretty much don't move. Like if you have a shallow water rock flat, you know there's going to be gobies all over it. If you know there's a big full moon and you have a big shallow rock bar, you know on that full moon, crawfish are going to spawn on it or hatch on it. And so they're way more predictable than the bait fish are. And that's Matt's biggest point here. And it's really, really tough. So what are the productive areas? And this is not going to be mind-blowing. I don't think this is going to surprise anyone, but what are the productive areas that I'm looking for to find smallmouth? The biggest thing is what are the types of cover that I'm looking for? And this is not specific types of cover, but it's styles of cover. And I'm looking for isolated pieces of cover, which is like one or two boulders in the middle of a sand flat. I'm looking for edges, which is along a drop-off, maybe where it goes from sand to rock, that hard edge, that transitional period, the transitional spot where these fish are going to move up and along this edge, or where there's mixing cover. So this could be a boulder field with a bunch of sand around it. This could be deeper water where you have some mixtures of grass or grass to sand or grass to rock. But these are the types of cover. These are the types of areas that I'm looking for. Isolated pieces of cover, edges, and mixing bottom composition or cover, pieces of cover. And then the key structures that I'm typically looking at for these are your turns and your points, the big humps that are in the middle of the lake that come out of deep water and come up. Super easy ambush point for bass. Your big flats, especially when you're in shallower water, your flats are going to play a big role. But also in deep water, your flats can be that sneaky spot that you pull up on where there's isolated boulders or rocks or rock piles, because those flats, they don't necessarily get graphed quite as much. And so that can be your spot to find like those sneaky out of the way smallmouth that a lot of guys are missing. And then finally your drop-offs, which drop-offs to me is kind of a cop-out, but this is really your edges. This is where those rock reefs fall off into the sand or into the deeper water basin. But really those are the key pieces of structure. Now we're going to look at them on a map so you understand what they look like and kind of how they can set up or relate to your style of body of water. So the biggest thing is turns and points. Okay, so this is number one, and I'm going to make this full screen for you because I think this is super critical. If you guys have any questions, please ask these questions as I go over these maps, but I think most of these are pretty obvious. So this spot here is where Taku Ito won the St. Lawrence tournament on Lake Ontario. So up here is Showmont Bay, and what you have here is a point. You have this little piece of a bay that comes out to a peninsula further to the right. I wish this would show my cursor. But you have this point that comes out right here with a very, very steep drop. And he was setting up just inside this steep drop, catching these fish, probably on isolated boulders or isolated pieces of cover, or maybe even just the drop off itself along this point. So he was fishing this deeper water area in about 26 to 30 foot of water. along this point. It's a very natural staging spot for them to come post spawn, but it's also a great summer spot because they have easy access to deeper water areas. Then you also have these shallower flats up here as well, either on top of the point or over here to the right in this little bay where you see these rock symbols. But this is a really good overall area. You have a staging spot coming out of a spawning bay as they transition back out to deep water. And they can either hold there for the summertime or they can stage and move along there as they start to move off deep. A great question from up north fishing. Are steep drops on the edge of flats good? Absolutely. That's kind of what you're seeing in this point or spot here on this point. But you're going to notice this on a spot on Lake St. Clair that I'm going to show you here in just a second. Probably one of those prominent flats on Lake St. Clair during the summertime. So this next one of these next slides is going to be a great indication of that. So, sorry. Piece of cover number 2 is going to be humps. Humps are a very notorious smallmouth spot. Now I'm going to be showing you a lot of areas that are on glacial bodies of water, as well as, excuse me, as well as the Great Lakes. But you can kind of apply these same things if you're fishing river areas, which on rivers you'd be looking for basins, you'd be looking for deep holes, as well as some small humps that the water can flow over faster or change the speed of the flow of the water, the current. But here's the Great Lakes, and here are a bunch of humps. This is a big series of humps. So up here on the left-hand side, you have this hump with a very steep drop. I'm going to start by idling over the steepest part of this and come across a shallow spot. Depending on how these fish are relating to the bait, and depending on how the bait's setting up in these areas, you're going to notice them move around these humps. And one of the benefits of fishing a hump is that regardless of wind direction, you're going to be able to have some sort of bait fish setting up on some of these humps. One of the biggest overlooked things is the direction of the wind or the direction of the current on the Great Lakes. And this took me years and years to understand. These smallmouth are going to be moving around on these humps, on these deeper water points, based on the current and based on the wind direction. So if you get a strong northeast wind that's blowing into these areas, because the wind's coming out of this direction, northeast wind, what's going to happen is these fish are actually going to set up on the push. They're going to set up on the front side of these drops. And as you can see, a lot of the steepest edges are actually on the northeast side. I think the reason for that is a lot of times when the glaciers came around, that was the easiest area for these to scrape out and drive, and that's why you have the steepest drops there. But a lot of times the smallmouth are going to hang out there as well. A lot of times the northeast side is also going to have the most debris, the most isolated or isolated cover or big boulder fields is going to be on the steepest drop-off side, and I think that's why it's so effective. But these fish are going to move around these areas based on wind direction, so you have to kind of understand that. But the benefit of fishing humps is that these fish have a bunch of different ways to move around these areas. Now here's the St. Clair spot, and this is a very prominent spot. It's not like I'm showing you something mind-blowing, or I shouldn't be, but this is one of the biggest flats on the lake, especially during the summertime. This is Muscatmoot Bay right here, and this is where it pushes out of the middle channel or the south channel. I'm not sure which they call it, but you have this channel coming out from the St. Clair River. So you have this insane amount of current that's flowing out of this river, and this is probably popping off right now. Insane amount of current coming out of this river. You have very steep drop alongside of this giant flat. So these fish not only have access to current-driven areas and current-driven spots along this flat and this drop-off, but they also have access to this drop-off. And this is actually where Chris Zaldane caught that giant smallmouth a couple years ago on St. Clair during the AOI Championship, was in this flat. But you struggle with the flat is you have to kind of cover a lot of water, but it can be a great area when these fish are pushing bait fish on these flats to go up and target some of the biggest fish. Another unique thing about this flat is you have these little humps on it, and you have these little turns. On St. Clair, it may not seem like much, and these are small turns, like 1 to 2 foot turns. These fish will get on these inside turns and these edges really effectively, just as effectively, if not more effectively, than they will actually get on these steep drops. So understanding how these fish move along these flats and understanding that each little contour change, like right here, is going to have a huge impact on these fish, will allow you to be way more effective when you're fishing flats. You're not necessarily looking for giant contour changes, and you're not necessarily looking for the isolated piece of cover. You're not necessarily looking for a very specific boulder. It could be something as small as a 6-inch to 2-foot contour change or difference. It's going to make a huge difference and hold a bunch of fish. A great question from Brian Davis as it relates to fishing flats. Are sand flats in 8 to 10 foot of water with cabbage and weeds and tons of perch good areas? They absolutely are. So one of my best spots that I ever had was on this giant flat, had some eladio, which is big leafy cabbage, and had a bunch of perch around it. The struggle was figuring out where they'd relate to those weeds and to that cabbage, and a lot of it had to do with wind. So what I figured out, and the grass is no longer there. The water got too high and the grass died off, and so it's no longer there. But what I figured out was, based on wind direction, these fish would move around. And a lot of times the fish tended to be onto the push, so the area that the wind was pushing into. And they'd also be on turns inside the grass edges. So what you could notice is there is, I'll put myself on camera again. There's a giant weed flat, and you have a small turn in the weed flat. These fish will get on these turns and get on the push side where the wind's blowing into it, because that's a lot of times the most easy area for them to sit. The bait fish are going to either come out of the grass or they're going to come into the grass. And a lot of times it's easier for them to ambush the bait as it comes into the grass than it is as they randomly push out of the grass. And so looking for little differences in the weed patch or the cabbage patch is going to be enormous for you, but also understand how those fish set up on it based on different wind directions is also going to be really important, and how it impacts the current pushing in. As this relates to river systems, I'm going to make myself full screen. As this relates to river systems, understanding the way that current is going to flow across that grass is also really important. You're going to look for areas where the current's a little bit slower, or maybe the current wants to flow around it a little bit differently. Understanding the current and how it flows around that grass is really critical for you, especially in reservoir systems and rivers, because that's where these bass are going to naturally want to hang out. They don't necessarily want to be in the fastest current, don't necessarily want to be in the slowest current. They're going to want to be in those areas where those fish are going to most easily be able to feed. So that is flats. And then drop-offs are pretty simple. Are there any questions before we get into the biggest keys and successes of being a successful or effective summertime smallmouth fisherman? Any more questions? And then we're going to kind of wrap this thing up. I'm not going to talk about baits. I don't think baits necessarily matter as much during the summertime. You have to really figure out where the fish are at, and then you can, I guess, pick the bait that's going to work most effectively for you. But we can touch on baits if you want, but it's not a point that I have set up in this seminar. Okay. Keys to catching summer smallmouth consistently. Biggest key, and I've mentioned this a couple times, is willingness to move and be open-minded. As you understand, and as I tried to explain, the weather conditions, the water conditions, and basically everything around you are going to cause these smallmouth to move. They live a nomadic lifestyle, so you need to be willing to move to find the bass. A lot of times if you're fishing through an area and you're not catching fish, those fish just aren't there. Especially when you're around big schools of fish, they tend to be very competitive. And so if the conditions are right and they're not biting and you don't see them on your graphs and you're not catching them, a lot of times those fish just aren't there. So be willing to move, be open-minded, try different things. If they're not on deep water, even though it's sunny and windy, maybe you want to go up shallow and cover some shallow water areas. Maybe you want to check different types or different depths of deeper water. So kind of be willing to move around, try different things, try different baits, and look for bait fish. And hopefully that'll help you be successful. But to do that, you have to understand how the forage moves and how the forage in your bodies of water impact where those smallmouth go. Not everyone has perch. Not everyone has gobies. Not everyone has shiners or alewife or whatever. You have to understand how the forage in your style of body of water move around the lake, and so that way you can be more effective in following them. Sometimes you just can't. Like, I hate to say this, but sometimes you just can't find the forage. What you have to do then is have different areas that you can run, maybe not forage driven, maybe not bait fish driven, maybe not crawfish or goby driven. Just have different styles of areas to run so you can find the fish, because sometimes you literally can't just find the bait. You just can't. It's just so hard to find it. And it's going to drive you crazy. You have to be willing to move around. And then understand how the weather and the wind is going to impact those spots, because a lot of times the weather and wind has a lot more impact than you think. Even though the wind is the nicest possible direction, right? You're fishing the west side of I'm just going to give it up. You're fishing the west side of Lake Huron. The wind's blowing out of the west, so it's a light wind. The problem is a lot of times on that west wind, on an area in the west, there's no turn that you can fish over there. So you're fishing the wrong side of a deep water area, and the fish just aren't there. You have to understand that the wind is blowing, and that's the backside of a deep water drop. Those fish aren't necessarily going to be on it. So maybe you have to fish it in the worst conditions, out of an east wind or northeast wind. You just have to understand how it all impacts these fish and how it moves these fish around. And then have multiple areas in various depths and around various types of cover. You have to have areas in deep water and shallow water and moderate depth in grass, in rock, in wood. Have a bunch of different things you can try, because then you unlock one piece of the puzzle. You figured out, okay, today they're on grass, right? Well, now you have 10 grass spots in relatively the same depths. Maybe they're on these other areas as well. But if you only have one spot, you're going to really struggle to consistently go and catch fish. You need to have a bunch of different areas you can run through and bounce around and be most effective. And really, those are the biggest things that I would recommend to be successful as a smallmouth angler during the summertime. Also, hopefully you don't have hair, because by the end of the day, you're going to have ripped it all out. These fish are going to move around, and I can give you every rule that you could ever possibly need. And you're still going to have days where you absolutely struggle and suck, because I do, and it's just not fun. But smallmouth are fun, so those are hopefully some tips that will help you guys. Did you touch on what's more applied to lakes, St. Clair and Ontario part? Okay, so for me, glacial style bodies of water are very tough, but these are where the small turns and understanding the way current is going to drive into certain areas, especially wind blown current, is going to drive these fish and drive the bait fish. But glacial style bodies of water, you're looking for very minuscule changes, very small turns, small contour changes, areas where fish can easily suspend but have access to the deep and shallow water. Glacial bodies of water are very tough, but just you have to understand small differences on a glacial body of water that has very little change is absolutely huge. What if the breaks go from 8 to 16 foot, but you can still see the bottom? Is it too shallow? No, it's not too shallow. You can catch fish in 2 foot of water with 100 foot of visibility, as long as the fish are up there shallow feeding on what they're following, right? But if you're fishing in 16 foot of water around a bottom where you know there's nothing, 1, there's no cover, 2, there's no bait fish, 3, those bass are not going to be there. You need to have something that's holding those fish there, and typically it's either cover or bait fish. And so you need to know that those are going to be the things that are going to drive me to that spot. The breaks on my body of water go from 10 to 40 foot. It can be productive to have those steeper breaks, but this is why I say glacial style bodies of water are the toughest during the summer. These fish, a lot of times on glacial style bodies of water, I hate to break it to you, are going to suspend. They're going to be tough. To get out there and catch 5 bites is a lot of times going to be really, really tough, and you have to go finesse, and you have to throw spy baits and jerk baits, and you have to cover very, very small specific areas and break it down really thoroughly, because there's not a lot of them. Glacial style bodies of water are very, very challenging, but if you understand how the fish are moving around them, you can pick apart very small areas and be really successful. Another thing on a glacial style body of water that can be really effective is a topwater bait. Especially when there's a light wind and it's sunny out, you can fish at topwater and draw these fish up to it. You can also fish baits that are super loud and obnoxious that draw the fish up to it like a big spinner bait. So we'll talk about baits for a second, but especially shallow water baits. You can get as obnoxious as you want in shallow water. You can drive these fish to your bait. The biggest thing with smallmouth is they're visual feeders. In shallow water, they're looking for something they can see effectively, come up and smash. So a big spinnerbait, 3/4 ounce with chartreuse blades, even though it looks stupid, you just burn that thing along in shallow water, keep the blades just under the top of the surface, and those fish will come up and get it. Big top waters, like big Jaywalker 120s, like the 5.5-inch Jaywalker with 3 hooks, super loud, obnoxious bait, draws these fish from a long ways in shallow water, and will catch those fish out of those really, really clean conditions in shallow water situations. Another thing, kind of going opposite end of the spectrum, spy baits. Small swim baits are really effective when they can see it a long ways. So don't be afraid to have a small swim bait that's 3 inches in length, looks like the little minnows they're feeding on, and just swim it mid-column. Like in shallow water, that can be the deal, but also in deeper water areas. Erie, September 11th and 12th. Are you fishing out of Buffalo, or are you fishing out of, like, on the east side or west side? I would typically be looking fairly deep, like on the east side or west side. I'm looking at like around the islands, Pelee Island, the sister islands, out of Sandusky. Man, I'm looking in like 25 to 30 foot of water. I'm looking deep. Especially, I mean, that's where a lot of those big mega schools are going to be around bait fish. I would look deep, man. Deep, isolated boulders. I'm looking for bait fish. I'm looking for the isolated stuff. So there's these mega reefs, right? You want to look for the scattered stuff around it. And a lot of times you're going to be super pressured fish. They've probably been fished 100 times since you got on them. Find the isolated boulder and cast to it. Don't drop on them. Those fish are smart. They've been there. They don't want those pings on their head. Cast to them. Even if you have live scope, I would recommend, if you have live scope, fishing a super pressured area, and you can see the specific boulder you need to cast to, figure out your lineup, turn the live scope away, give it 10 seconds, and cast to it. Or cast to it, looking at it, and then turn your live scope away. These fish are getting very smart very quickly. Live scope, they're actually seeing, I've seen where they get super keyed in on it and will turn off that bait because they can feel the ping from that live scope. Just like a transducer, live scope is going to drive these fish away from baits just as effectively, or just as much, if not more, than traditional sonar, because it's very directed pings. Nugget 316 Ultrax. Man, I'm looking for isolated cover in deep water. Jim Boyko asked, what are your thoughts on the Bassett channel and Johnson channel? I don't know. Man, I'm sorry. I fish St. Clair like 3 times a year. So other than like the super community holes, I don't really know many spots. I just have a couple sneaky things. But if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to end this thing here. So hit me up with any questions you guys might have. But before you do that, I would really appreciate it. Hit that like button. Share it with your friends. I think this was a really detailed live stream, so there's a lot of things you can share and you can learn and we can grow from as we go into future live streams. So share this with your friends if you have anyone that likes to smallmouth fish during the summertime. But also, as I mentioned as well, this was sponsored by Acaso. Acaso sent me this awesome cooler. It's really, really good. It is really, really good cooler. I'm not just saying that. Holds ice for like 3 days, which I never expected from this. So if you guys want to check this out, it's $145 right now on Amazon. You can find the link down in my description, as opposed to $430 from Yeti. It's basically the same thing. They asked me to just keep saying that. Like, this is literally almost identical to the Yeti one for a third of the price. I've never fished Walloon. Andrew Knox says, where do you find the smallmouth in the summer? In the lake. Erie walleye boats, 50 to 55 foot. I'm sure they are. Depends on where you're at on Erie, but like I know, so especially the western end of Erie, guys are catching about like 60 to 80 foot of water. You go out there and you drop shot with like a 3/4 ounce drop shot, and you're just like, wow, waiting for it. But yeah, you can catch them out of super deep water. It's just tough. That's so tough on those fish. Like when you catch them out of 30 plus, that's really tough on fish, but you can catch them and you can catch some giants. I'd love to fish Sturgeon Bay. I was talking to Mikey Balls about that. We were talking about going over there next spring. Anyways, guys, thank you so much. If you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Take care, Taillands. God bless. Pursue your passion.